A Course in Miracles. Lesson 30. God is in everything I see because God is in my mind. The idea for today is the springboard for vision. From this idea will the world open up before you, and you will look upon it and see in it what you have never seen before, nor will what you saw before be even faintly visible to you. Today we are trying to use a new kind of projection. We are not attempting to get rid of what we do not like by seeing it outside. Instead, we are trying to see in the world what is in our minds, and what we want to recognize is there. Thus, we are trying to join with what we see, rather than keeping it apart from us. That is the fundamental difference between vision and the way you see. Today's idea should be applied as often as possible throughout the day. Whenever you have a moment or so, repeat it to yourself slowly, looking about you, and trying to realize that the idea applies to everything you do see now, or could see now if it were within the range of your sight. Real vision is not limited to concepts such as near and far. To help you begin to get used to this idea, try to think of things beyond your present range, as well as those you can actually see as you apply today's idea. Real vision is not only unlimited by space and distance, but it does not depend on the body's eyes at all. The mind is its only source. To aid in helping you to become more accustomed to this idea as well, devote several practice periods to applying today's idea with your eyes closed, using whatever subjects come to mind, and looking within rather than without. Today's idea applies equally to both. The springboard for vision. God is in everything I see because God is in my mind is the springboard for vision because it shifts the entire foundation of how we perceive the world. Normally, we believe we are passive observers, that the world exists independently of us and we merely witness it. But this lesson upends that belief. It tells us that seeing is not about passively receiving information, but about actively projecting what is already within us. Think of it like a radio. The station you tune into determines what you hear. If you're locked into static, it doesn't mean there's nothing being broadcast. It just means your receiver isn't aligned. But the moment you tune into the right frequency, music or a clear signal comes through. The world we see is the broadcast of our minds. If our thoughts are filled with fear, lack and separation, that's the station we're tuned into, and that's all we hear. But when we recognize that God is in our minds, we start transmitting a new signal, and suddenly the world opens up before us. The broadcast hasn't changed, only our reception has. This is why the old world, the one we thought was real, begins to fade. It was never the world itself that was dark or broken, it was simply the distortion of our own misaligned frequency. When we correct the source, the mind, the output, the world we see, changes instantly. A new kind of projection. Projection, as we usually understand it, is an unconscious attempt to get rid of what we don't want to deal with by seeing it outside of ourselves. If we feel unworthy, we find evidence of rejection in the world. If we harbor resentment, we see enemies everywhere. This kind of projection keeps us stuck because it reinforces the illusion that what we dislike is out there, separate from us, and not something we need to address internally. But today's lesson flips projection on its head. Instead of using it to push away what we don't want, we use it to extend what we do want, to recognize that love, holiness, and unity are already in our minds, and therefore they are also in the world. It's like switching out a film reel in a projector. The machine itself stays the same, but the story it tells is completely different. The only thing that has changed is the content we have chosen to project. If we accept that God is in our minds, then we can only project what is in God's mind: love, unity, and wholeness. The ego would have us believe we can project something else, something opposite. But in reality, only love is real. Everything else is just interference, like static on the radio. How we try to get rid of what we don't like. The lesson tells us that we are not trying to get rid of what we don't like by seeing it outside of us. But this is exactly what we have been doing all our lives. We critique how someone looks, as if their appearance has anything to do with us. We judge their financial status, their profession, their choices, as if labeling them in a certain way changes our own internal discomfort. We fixate on external conditions, blaming politics, blaming our upbringing, blaming others for how we feel, because it is easier to project the cause outward than to look within. But if all perception comes from the mind, then what we see in others is only a reflection of what we believe about ourselves. If we look out and see lack, we must have first believed in lack within. If we see separation, we must have first accepted that separation was real. And if we are willing to see God in everything, then we must first acknowledge that God is already in our minds, joining instead of separating. We are trying to join with what we see rather than keeping it apart from us. This is a fundamental shift. The ego's way of seeing is built on separation. We believe there is a world out there that we must deal with, manage, or control. We assume cause and effect are disconnected, that the world causes us to feel certain things rather than our thoughts being the source of what we experience. But this lesson reminds us that there is no gap between the mind and the world it perceives. It's not that we have thoughts and then later see them manifest in the world. It's that thought and perception are simultaneous. The moment a thought occurs, it is already shaping our experience. There is no neutral thought. Every thought extends outward, creating the lens through which we perceive everything else. To join with what we see means to recognize that we are not separate from it. If we see beauty, we recognize that beauty is within us. If we see love, we understand that love is already in our minds. And if we see division, it is only because we have accepted division within ourselves. There is no split. The world is simply mirroring back to us what we hold in mind. Real vision is not limited by near and far. The lesson tells us that real vision is not limited by space or distance. This is because real vision does not come from the body's eyes. It comes from the mind. Think of how you can close your eyes and instantly picture a loved one who is miles away. In an instant, they are present in your awareness, not because you traveled to them, but because your mind is not bound by distance. In the same way, when we train ourselves in vision, we begin to understand that what we see is not limited by what is physically in front of us. This is why the lesson encourages us to think beyond our present range, to consider things we cannot see, but could see if our vision were not bound by the body's limitations. We are being trained to recognize that perception is not about proximity, but about awareness. When we recognize that everything is connected, space and distance become meaningless concepts. The mind is the only source of vision. The mind is its only source. This is a crucial idea. The world we see does not cause our perception. Our mind projects the world we see. This means we are never truly seeing out there. We are only ever seeing the contents of our own minds reflected back at us. If you watch a movie and the picture on the screen is distorted, you don't try to fix the screen, you check the projector. Likewise, when we see distortion in the world, the correction is not in the world itself, but in the mind that is projecting it. Real vision then requires looking inward first. This is why the lesson encourages us to practice with our eyes closed, to train us to rely less on the body's eyes and more on the recognition that vision is an inner process, bringing it all together. This lesson is not asking us to create something new. It is asking us to recognize what has always been there. The world does not need to change. Our perception of it does. When we stop trying to get rid of what we don't like by projecting it outward, we free ourselves from judgment and separation. When we accept that God is in our minds, we begin to see a world filled with holiness, because that is what we have chosen to recognize. It's not that the world itself has suddenly transformed. It's that we have finally tuned into the right frequency. We have swapped out the old film reel and are now playing the only story that was ever real, the story of love, unity, and God's presence in everything.